Ho ho ho, and welcome to this episode of Deck Doctor. I am Santa Blood, and I will be bringing you some SMOrc for the season. Yes, we are going to be tackling Red Rush this time, and this is Crow 77's list, which he achieved God rank with. And Crow, if you do not know who he is a fantastic caster, streamer, and player qualifying for December's monthly cup. This is a great deck for new players to learn, and it is a very cheap deck as well, so you'll be SMOrcing away during the holidays with this fantastic list. So let's get right into it, guys, and talk about Red Rush. So to start things off, we have the Axe Grinder. This guy features in plenty of red decks, but he first found his place in Red Rush back when he was buffed. And being able to get +1/+1 was a big deal for Red Rush, as he had a cheap, aggressive creature that can continue to put pressure on their opponent. So you want to be getting him down in the Axe Grinder spots, as we've called them. We've covered them in the past videos. But when I get to the land placement guide, you'll see exactly where you want to be getting your mountains. Now, one of the great things about Axe Grinder as well is one of the habits of a Red Rush player is once they got the aggressive lands down, they don't generate a lot of Faeria, but a lot of their creatures cost between 3 and 5. So they like to use the power wheel to get Faeria and then just play a creature. And you kind of just pump out creatures every turn that way. The great thing about Axe Grinder is he only costs 3 Faeria, so he costs your production cost. And then you can do something else with your power wheel. Maybe draw a card, maybe save some Faeria for next turn. So this card is one of the best cards in the deck, and this is where Axe Grinder first got his reputation. It was back when Red Rush was popular. Next up, we have Cypher's Fodder, a great 4/3 body for 4 Faeria. He also synergizes with some of the other cards in this deck, like Shemdim Pest and Firebringer, which we'll talk about a little bit later. He has a last word of deal 2 damage, so it's going to help you accelerate your win condition in being aggressive. So if your opponents want to remove the Cypher's Fodder, it is going to come at a price. Next up, we have Fire Elemental. Fire Elemental is a card that's going to allow you to develop mountains off its gift effect and not have to use your power wheel. This is great because it helps you accelerate mountains quicker. So you can like go double neutral mountain, Fire Elemental mountain, and that gets you right up to your opponent's orb. But it also allows you to get an aggressive body down, which they have to answer. 5 attack can be very devastating against some decks that don't pack popular removals. And it does free up your power wheel once again. You don't have to develop mountains. This kind of guy does it for you, allowing you to draw cards or gain Faeria if you do need it. Last but not least, we have the King's Faithful. This is the best card you can get in your opening hand for the Mulligan, because sometimes you're going to have to double neutral twice to get up to your opponent's orb, and then you start developing mountains, which is what makes Axe Grinder so strong as well, because you can play him for 1 mountain. And King's Faithful is perfect for your opener, because you get to develop a 4/1 with protection on turn 2 right up in front of your opponent, and it's very durable because of that protection. He only has 1 health, sure, but against some decks he's a real pain to get rid of. So let's move on to the removal cards, which are a combination of events and a creature. So pretty standard events in this deck. We have Cypher's Wrath and Flame Burst. Cypher's Wrath removes a creature or helps you kill a creature and you deal 2 damage, accelerating your win condition. Flame Burst is a great finisher in this deck. That's one of its greatest uses, is to just pile up on Flame Burst, just deal plenty of damage, and eventually it'll run out of steam. But your opponent will still be trying to recover from the onslaught of creatures they've had to answer, especially from their well spots. And then you just kind of double Flame Burst to finish off, or sometimes even triple Flame Burst. So Flame Burst actually acts kind of a finisher most of the time, but you can also use it to remove Faeria Gatherers if you want to start your opponent on Faeria, or help you clear a creature that's standing in your way. And that's another thing Bomb Slinger does. So a 4/1 that deals 4 damage as its gift to an adjacent structure or creature. So this can get rid of Forbidden Libraries, which is really good. But it also synergizes with some of the other cards in the deck, which I mentioned earlier, Shemdim Pest and Firebringer. So it has great synergies in Red Rush anyway, and we've seen it featured in mid-red in the past. So a great removal card, but you also get the benefits of it being an aggressive body as a 4/1, so it can deal quite a bit of damage. So let's move on to the cards that do get buffed by all these creatures that have more attack than the defense. So Shemdin Pest is one of your heavier hitters in this deck. A 4 Faeria 4/2 that gets +2/+2 if you control at least a creature with more attacks than health. And a 6/4 for 4 Faeria is an excellent stat line. That challenges stuff like Ancient Herald that costs 6 Faeria. Grove Guardians, which cost 5, Ground Shakers, for example. So a very good aggressive body, but also can trade up the curve quite easily because of its stat line. And you're going to want to be getting these guys buffed. You don't want to develop a Shemdin Pest raw without the bonus, unless you're really, really desperate. Remember, you can play a Shemdin Pest on its own with no buff, and then buff another Shemdin Pest from your hand straight away. So that's one situation where you might play a Shemdin Pest on its own, but most cases you're not going to want to do that. Next up, we have HC, the 6 Faeria 2 Mountain 4/4 that gets -1 reduction to its cost every time you play a creature with an attack higher than life. And if we look back at the other creatures we've seen in this deck, you can see how this all comes together now. HC did feature in mid-red as well as Firebringer, but you know, you're able to really out-tempo your opponent if you get these reduced quite early on. So by about turn 6, when you're trying to close out the game, you can usually develop a creature and an Axe Grinder, and most of your time your opponent's going to be trying to defend, so the resources are going to be really low, and that's usually going to be the final push that closes out the game. So this is a great way to establish board dominance once you start running out of steam in kind of the mid-late game. Last but not least is another finisher in this deck. This is the guy that gets buffed up for all these creatures you're playing, and this is kind of the nail in the coffin, a bit like Zealous Crusader. You dropped a big Firebringer down next to your opponent's orb or next to one of their well spots, and then they usually can't answer it and you can finish off your opponent. Or you can use it to challenge some of the bigger creatures your opponents might have on board, and they might have to trade off then, and they're kind of starting from scratch again, and you'll just develop another creature next turn anyway. So Firebringer is really great in this deck, and these 3 cards just really what makes this deck powerful as a rush deck. So let's talk about the Mulligans. Well, don't all these creatures look familiar? And that's right, the creatures I talked about earlier are the cards you want to have in your opening hand. You definitely want to have the King's Faithful, which I explained earlier, just because you want to pump out as many neutrals as possible. Fire Elemental accelerates your mountains, allowing you to get Shemdin Pest down quicker. But Axe Grinders and Cypher's Fodders, if you can get one of those, you can go double neutral mountain and then drop one of these cards, and then you can start your aggression from then. So these are the cards you're definitely going to look for. Hard mulligan for either of these, but your priority is mainly the King's Faithful. So let's look at some of the alternative cards you can keep in your hand if you do have 1 or 2 of these in your opening hand already. So removal is always a great stuff to have in your hand to complement aggression, because if you have your aggressive creatures from your mulligan already, you can keep some removal so you can stop your opponent from Faeria gathering, take care of something that's in the way of your creature from hitting face. So Cypher's Wrath and Flameburst obviously fulfill those roles, but you do want to have one of the creatures mentioned in the earlier slide before you decide to keep any of these. Lastly, Shemdin Pest. If you do have one of those creatures, you can keep the Shemdin Pest to go with it, because it does cost 1 mountain as well, and you'll be able to get its buff immediately, so you can play, say, the Axe Grinder into the Shemdin Pest, so he immediately gets buffed, then you have 2 threats that are going to be up against your opponent's orb. So let's talk about land placement and how you're going to be winning these games. So developing land with this deck is pretty straightforward. All you want to do is build up right up the middle, and we've talked about this previously in the video, with neutrals or with the help of Fire Elemental, and then you choose a side and take control of that side and get a mountain right in the well spot here. So after you've built your neutrals, you take these mountain spots, only one of them. You don't need both of them. You just want to build one side, and once you get that mountain, you want to keep developing creatures on that mountain and pushing forward and dealing damage. And there'll be many occasions in this deck where you're going to use your power wheel to gain Faeria, just so you can play stuff like a Fire Elemental, a Shemdin Pest, and that's why the Axe Grinder is such a good card, because you don't need to use your power wheel to gain Faeria, you can just play it from your production. And it's a 5/4 as well, so it has an amazing stat line. And that's pretty much Red Rush in a nutshell. You kind of just create enormous amounts of pressure from one side of your opponent's well, and you just overwhelm them until you can finish them off with a Flame Burst creature hit or a Firebringer that they can't handle. So yeah, that pretty much wraps up Red Rush. It's a very easy deck to pilot, and it's very beginner friendly, and it's one of the cheaper aggressive decks you can build in this game. And that is my guide on Red Rush. Thank you very much for watching, and thank you for supporting Play Faeria throughout the year. I hope my guides have been very helpful to you. So have a Merry Christmas with your family and friends, and I will see you again next time. Take care. Bye-bye now.